The first sign that humanity was different was not fire or steel or the radio whispering across empty distances, but a ledger. It was a simple thing, etched into a wall of basalt in a cavern on a world whose sky had never known a human gaze. The marks were shallow, repeated, patient, each line recording a cycle of hunger and survival. The species that made those marks believed, with perfect certainty, that intelligence flowered only once the struggle ended. They believed minds grew delicate when fed and sheltered, and that hardship crushed thought into brute reaction. They were wrong, and they were about to meet a people who counted hardship as a tutor rather than an enemy. Humanity reached the wider galaxy late, not because they were slow to dream, but because they were busy surviving. Their home star was young and violent, its flares scouring early skies, its planets locked in chaotic dances. Life there learned to endure variability or die. Over ages too long to count, cells learned repair, organisms learned redundancy, cultures learned adaptation. By the time humans looked up and wondered if anyone else was out there, they had already internalized a lesson the galaxy had largely forgotten. Stability was a luxury, and progress came from negotiating with instability rather than erasing it. The vessel Wanderer carried that inheritance in its bones. It was not sleek by the standards of the older civilizations. Its hull bore layers of composite and patchwork reinforcement, every addition a response to a problem encountered and solved. Inside, corridors bent around redundancies, systems overlapped, and nothing depended on a single point of failure. The crew joked that the ship could lose half its mass and still limp home, but the humor masked a deeper truth. They trusted in preparation, not perfection. The first contact did not happen with a grand broadcast or a ceremonial meeting. It happened when Wanderer emerged from faster-than-light transition near a brown dwarf surrounded by a thin disk of debris and detected a structure that should not have been there. It was vast, angular, and unmistakably artificial, its surfaces faceted like a crystal grown by mathematics rather than chance. It hung in a stable orbit, dark and quiet, watching. Captain Marable Quan stood at the forward display, hands clasped behind her back, eyes narrowed not in fear but in focus. She had grown up on a coastal arcology where storms were weekly events and infrastructure failed often enough that children learned early how to improvise. To her, the unknown was not an abyss, but a puzzle. Sensors resolved the structure in greater detail. It was a station, though unlike any human design. Its geometry followed a logic that prioritized efficiency of volume and line of sight. There were no obvious docking ports, no lights, no signals. It was, however, active. Energy flowed within it in patterns too complex to be automated without intelligence. Open channel, Quan said, broad spectrum. Mathematical greeting. The signal went out, a sequence of prime numbers and physical constants encoded in pulses of radiation. The station did not respond immediately. Minutes passed. The crew waited, tension present but contained. They had trained for this, not in the sense of rehearsed scripts, but in mental posture. Expect delay, expect misunderstanding, expect nothing. When the response came, it was not a mirror of their greeting. It was a flood. Data slammed into the ship, overwhelming initial buffers before adaptive systems rerouted and compressed on the fly. It was structured, layered, and dense with meaning. Linguists and systems analysts scrambled as translation frameworks spun up. The station was not speaking in a language. It was offering an archive. Within the torrent were images of alien anatomies, star maps, records of chemical analyses, sociological models, and philosophical treatises. There were accounts of thousands of species, their rise and fall catalogued with meticulous neutrality. There was no narrative voice, no emotional coloring. It was a library thrown open without preface. As the first coherent interpretations formed, a pattern emerged that chilled the room. The species that built the station called themselves the Karun, though the sound was only an approximation of a concept that meant something like those who endured long enough. They were ancient, predating most known interstellar societies. They had watched civilizations bloom and wither, had catalogued them all, and had drawn conclusions. The core thesis of the archive was simple and ruthless. Intelligent life, given sufficient time and resources, inevitably optimized away struggle. In doing so, it optimized away creativity, resilience, and adaptability. Cultures stabilized, minds specialized, and when a truly novel crisis emerged, they failed. The galaxy was littered with their remnants. The Karun saw themselves as custodians, not conquerors. They believed intervention was necessary, but not guidance. They culled. When a civilization reached a certain level of technological sophistication and environmental stability, the Karun tested it with controlled catastrophes. Those that adapted survived and were allowed to continue. Those that did not were erased, their knowledge archived as cautionary examples. Humanity, according to the initial analysis, had just crossed the threshold. The bridge was silent as the implications settled. Quan felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came not from fear but from responsibility. She had no illusions about human perfection. She knew their history was marred by cruelty and error, but she also knew their capacity to respond to crisis, to fracture and reform, to argue fiercely and still cooperate when survival demanded it. "Send acknowledgement," she said. "Request dialogue." The response came faster this time. A construct detached from the station, a shard of the larger geometry, and approached Wanderyear. It matched velocity and orientation with unsettling precision, as though it had always known how. Inside the shard, there was an interface. Not a screen or a voice, but a field that induced patterns directly in neural tissue. The crew debated sending a human, but the construct made its expectations clear. It would not adapt. If humanity wished to be heard, it would have to meet the Karun on their terms. Quan volunteered. She had a talent for absorbing unfamiliar frameworks, a mental flexibility honed by years of navigating both bureaucratic labyrinths and literal storms. She entered the construct alone, trusting her ship and her people to retrieve her if needed. The moment the interface engaged, her perception expanded. She did not lose herself, but she gained access to a mode of thought that was not sequential but relational. Concepts were not words but shapes, tensions, gradients. The Karun presence was vast, not in volume but in context. It encompassed histories and probabilities with equal ease. "You are anomalous," the presence conveyed, not as accusation but as observation. "Your species exhibits high cognitive plasticity under duress. Your social structures tolerate instability without collapse. This contradicts established models." Quan focused, anchoring herself in memory and intent. "Our home taught us to live with change," she projected. "We did not have the luxury of assuming tomorrow would look like today." The presence considered. "Your environment was hostile. That accelerates certain adaptations. However, your expansion into stable systems will alter you. You will optimize, you will weaken." "Perhaps," Quan replied. "Or perhaps we will carry our habits with us. We build redundancies because we expect failure. We argue because consensus can be brittle. We do not seek to eliminate struggle, only to make it survivable." The Karun presence shifted, its internal patterns reconfiguring. It projected examples from its archive, civilizations that had claimed similar philosophies only to stagnate once their material conditions improved. Quan did not deny the risk. "We fail often," she said. "We know that, but we also remember failure. We teach it. We institutionalize skepticism. Our stories are full of cautionary tales, not just triumphs." This was new. The Karun models had accounted for data retention, but not cultural valorization of error. They had assumed intelligent beings would seek to forget pain once it was no longer necessary. "Your species maintains narratives of suffering beyond their utility," the presence observed. "That is inefficient." "It is," Quan agreed. "But it is also grounding. It reminds us that comfort is contingent." The presence withdrew slightly, not in rejection but in recalibration. The test protocols had been designed for civilizations that sought equilibrium. Humanity's baseline was dynamic. There will be a trial, the Karun conveyed, not erasure, not yet, a stressor calibrated beyond your current experience. If you adapt, you will be classified as persistent. Quan accepted this with a steady mind. We will not thank you for it, she said, but we will meet it. When she returned to Wandeer, she carried not just the memory of the exchange, but a seed of understanding. The galaxy was old, and it was tired of watching itself decay. The Karun were not villains in the simple sense. They were guardians of a pattern they believed essential. Humanity would have to prove that another pattern was possible. As Wandeer set course back toward human space, the crew worked through the data, sharing it with every relay they could reach. There would be panic, debate, denial. Governments would argue, markets would shudder. There would be those who advocated submission, those who called for preemptive war, and those who insisted it was all a misunderstanding. Quan knew the chaos was inevitable. She also knew it was, in its way, a strength. Humans did not move as one mind. They moved as a swarm of perspectives, colliding and diverging, occasionally aligning long enough to build something resilient. The Karun were watching, measuring response times and adaptability curves. They believed the test would reveal the truth. On Earth, storms battered coastlines and people rebuilt. On frontier worlds, systems failed and colonists improvised. In data centers and classrooms, analysts and students alike grappled with the idea that survival itself was under examination. Humanity had been tested by its star, its planet, and itself. Now the galaxy had taken notice. The ledger on the basalt wall would soon have a new set of marks, recording not hunger or shelter, but the first tremors of a trial unlike any before. Whether those marks would end in a tally of erasure or endurance remained to be seen, but one thing was already clear to those who watched closely. This species did not equate survival with comfort. It equated survival with learning. The trial began without spectacle. There was no countdown transmitted from the angular station, no ultimatum etched in threatening geometry. Instead, small deviations rippled through the systems humanity depended upon, like the first tremors before a quake that only seasoned engineers could feel in their bones. Navigation beacons flickered with fractional timing errors. Fusion plants reported efficiency losses that fell within tolerances but resisted correction. Communication relays experienced delays measured in heartbeats rather than minutes, just enough to frustrate but not enough to alarm. At first, most administrators attributed the anomalies to the ordinary friction of a growing interstellar network. Human expansion had outpaced standardization, legacy systems coexisted with experimental upgrades, and compatibility issues were a known nuisance. Work orders were filed, diagnostic routines were run, teams cursed quietly and adapted. The galaxy watched as the species did what it always did when the ground shifted slightly underfoot. It adjusted its stance. The Karun observed through instruments that did not privilege any single vantage point. They did not focus on capitals or flagships. They tracked response patterns across populations, measuring not only technical fixes but social reverberations. They noted that complaints did not bottleneck at authorities but diffused laterally through professional communities. Independent technicians shared workarounds on open channels. Colonists jury-rigged solutions and documented them publicly. There was irritation, but also engagement. When the second phase arrived, it was ecological. On agricultural worlds tuned for maximal yield, pollinator drones began to misclassify native analogs, skipping some species and overservicing others. Crop models diverged from reality. In hydroponic towers, nutrient balances drifted unpredictably. The disruptions were subtle enough that no single farm failed outright, but yields dipped across regions. Food markets tightened, prices fluctuated, old anxieties resurfaced. Here, the Karun expected a familiar cascade. In archived cases, societies optimized for abundance responded to scarcity with centralized control and suppression of deviation. They expected hoarding, unrest, and brittle enforcement. They prepared their ledgers accordingly. What they saw instead forced revisions. Human communities argued fiercely, but they also experimented. Some reverted to older, less efficient, but more robust crop strains preserved in gene banks precisely for contingencies no one wanted to imagine. Others diversified production rather than doubling down on a single staple. Urban populations accepted rationing schemes not because they were imposed, but because they were negotiated publicly, debated in assemblies and forums until they were seen as temporary tools rather than permanent losses. There were protests, yes, but there were also teach-ins, communal kitchens, and a surge in amateur agronomy. People who had never planted anything learned to coax food from balcony trays and recycled containers. It did not solve the problem at scale, but it changed the tenor of the response. Scarcity became a shared puzzle rather than an invisible punishment. The Karun noted an increase in what their models labeled inefficient behavior, time spent debating ethics, resources allocated to redundancy rather than optimization, emotional labor expended on reassurance. According to established metrics, these were liabilities. According to emergent patterns, they were shock absorbers. The third phase was psychological. Dream cycles across multiple worlds began to exhibit convergence. Not identical images, but shared motifs of pursuit, of unfinished tasks, of structures that almost made sense but never quite resolved. Sleep studies showed elevated cognitive load during rest periods. Productivity dipped. Art surged. Stories, visual constructs, and speculative treatises proliferated, grappling with a sense of being watched without clear malice. The Karun had introduced a low-level mimetic field, tuned to amplify uncertainty. In prior trials, such fields accelerated cultural fatigue. Populations lost confidence in their narratives, retreating into apathy or fanaticism. Either outcome simplified the calculus of erasure. Humanity reacted with confusion and, again, argument. Some declared the experiences proof of external manipulation. Others insisted it was mass hysteria. A few fringe groups claimed revelation. None of these positions dominated for long. Instead, the conversations layered. Neuroscientists collaborated with philosophers. Storytellers dissected their own tropes in public, demystifying the fear by naming it. Humor emerged, dark and self-aware, a pressure valve that refused to seal. Captain Marable Kwan, now back within human space, watched these developments with a mix of pride and dread. She had been pulled into advisory roles she never sought, her encounter with the Karun dissected and reinterpreted by committees that alternated between reverence and suspicion. She insisted, repeatedly, that the Karun were not demons or gods, but systems acting on flawed premises. She argued that the trial was not a test of strength or unity, but of adaptability without surrendering complexity. Her words circulated, were criticized, remixed, and occasionally ignored. She accepted this. Influence, she believed, was less about control than about adding another variable to the equation. The fourth phase arrived as a compression of time. Supply chains that relied on precise synchronization began to desynchronize. Ships arrived early or late by margins that compounded down the line. Inventories mismatched forecasts. Just-in-time manufacturing faltered. The efficiencies humanity prized became liabilities as slack vanished. This was the moment the Karun expected collapse. In their archives, this phase often triggered authoritarian consolidation. Leaders seized control to enforce order, trading flexibility for predictability. Innovation slowed. When the final stressor arrived, these societies shattered. Human responses diverged sharply across regions. Some administrations did attempt centralization, issuing rigid schedules and penalties. These measures worked briefly, then failed as reality refused to conform. Elsewhere, networks deliberately introduced slack. They overstocked, delayed launches, accepted idle time as a cost. Economists argued in public about the value of inefficiency. The word resilience, long abused as a platitude, regained specificity. On one industrial moon, a transport guild voted to abandon synchronized convoys in favor of staggered departures. Losses increased initially, then stabilized. When an unexpected solar event disrupted half the routes, the staggered system absorbed the shock, while the synchronized routes suffered cascading failures. The case study spread, not as doctrine, but as example. The Karun recalibrated again. Their models had not anticipated a species willing to voluntarily relinquish short-term gains for long-term adaptability without a singular authority enforcing the sacrifice. The phenomenon did not fit clean categories of collectivism or individualism. It was something messier, emergent from overlapping incentives and cultural habits of argument. The fifth phase was the hardest to observe and the most revealing. The Karun withdrew overt stressors and waited. In previous trials, this lull exposed fragility. Societies, exhausted by prolonged strain, relaxed prematurely, maintenance lapsed. Old hierarchies reasserted themselves. When the final blow fell, it met unprepared systems. Humanity did not relax, but neither did it remain in crisis mode. Instead, there was a conscious reckoning. Debriefs proliferated at every scale, not just technical reviews, but social autopsies. What had broken, what had bent, what had surprised. Failures were not buried, they were annotated. Education systems incorporated the recent disruptions almost immediately. Students analyzed live data rather than sanitized historical cases. Children learned that the world could change under them and that this was not a moral failing. Mental health frameworks shifted from restoring baseline to cultivating flexibility. There was grief, but it was contextualized rather than denied. The Karun watched individuals who had lost livelihoods retrain into entirely new fields in midlife. They watched communities maintain rituals even when their original meanings were obsolete, adapting symbolism to new realities. They watched dissent persist without calcifying into schism. In the Karun archive, persistence was defined as survival past the stress horizon. But another metric began to assert itself, one they had not named before: coherence without rigidity. Diversity without disintegration, learning without erasure of memory. The final phase, when it came, was not a catastrophe but a choice. The Karun transmitted a narrowband signal to select human receivers, including Quan. The message was stark. The trial parameters had been exceeded. Humanity had not only adapted, but altered the test environment itself through feedback loops the Karun had not predicted. The custodians faced a decision: escalate beyond ethical bounds they had set for themselves, or revise their doctrine. Quan was summoned again, this time not alone. A small delegation joined her, representing disciplines rather than polities. An engineer who specialized in failure modes, a sociologist from a marginal colony, a historian whose work focused on collapsed empires, a systems ecologist who spoke more easily in metaphors than equations. The construct that received them was unchanged, but the presence within felt different, less certain of its own conclusions. Your species has met criteria for persistence, the Karun conveyed. However, persistence, as we have defined it, may be incomplete. The historian responded first. Your ledger records survival, she said. It does not record transformation. You erase those who fail to adapt quickly enough, but you also erase paths not taken. The engineer added, you assume that optimization leads inevitably to fragility. We agree it can. Our response has been to complicate our systems, not simplify them. Complexity carries its own risks, but it also creates buffers you do not measure. The sociologist leaned into the field, thoughts sharp. You test societies as if they are machines with inputs and outputs. We are also narratives. Meaning affects behavior. You introduce stress without context, and then judge responses without understanding the stories people tell themselves about that stress. The Karun presence absorbed these perspectives, its internal gradients shifting. You propose that struggle is not merely a filter, but a language, it said, that how it is interpreted matters. Yes, Quan replied. And you have been speaking to the galaxy in a language that only some can understand. Those that cannot are silenced, and you assume that proves your point. There it was, the forbidden word hovering unspoken, erasure. The Karun had never framed their actions in such terms. They saw themselves as gardeners pruning for health, but the image no longer fit cleanly. If we cease intervention, the presence asked, what prevents stagnation? We do, Quan said simply, not perfectly, not permanently, but we build mechanisms to remind ourselves of risk. We do not seek a final equilibrium. We expect disruption and plan to be changed by it. The ecologist smiled faintly. In our ecosystems, disturbance regimes maintain diversity. Fire, flood, predation. Remove them entirely, and the system collapses in a different way. The answer is not elimination, but scale and integration. The Karun withdrew into deliberation that spanned moments and millennia simultaneously. Their archive glowed with new annotations, old certainties tagged for review. They had thought themselves custodians of an immutable principle. Now they confronted the possibility that they had been enforcing a local optimum on a galactic scale. We will suspend culling protocols, the presence finally conveyed. Not indefinitely, we will observe, we will learn. It was not an apology. The Karun did not yet have a framework for that, but it was a concession that mattered. As the delegation returned to human space, news spread unevenly, refracted through hope and suspicion. Some celebrated, others warned that observation was merely a slower threat. Quan addressed none of it directly. She knew that certainty was neither possible nor desirable. The trial had not ended. It had changed shape. Somewhere on the basalt wall in the Karun cavern, a new symbol was etched, not a tally mark, but a branching line. It represented a case that did not resolve into success or failure, but into ongoing variance. For the first time in their long record, the ledger acknowledged an open system. Humanity went on arguing, building, failing, and adapting, unaware of how close it had come to being reduced to a footnote. The galaxy, older and more cautious now, watched a species that did not seek to end struggle, but to converse with it. The measure of unyielding minds was no longer whether they could endure a test, but whether they could change the nature of testing itself. Suspension of the culling protocols did not mean peace. It meant a tension. Where once the Karun had acted as distant arbiters, now they became observers in earnest, their instruments reoriented from verdict to inquiry. For humanity, this shift was almost more unsettling than the trial itself. A known threat could be rallied against, modeled, mythologized. An unknown audience, silently recording every stumble and improvisation, pressed on older anxieties about judgment and worth. The effects were uneven. Some populations felt a surge of resolve, interpreting the suspension as validation. Others felt exposed, as though the galaxy had leaned in closer, just as they realized how improvised their structures truly were. The absence of an immediate existential clock allowed internal tensions, long suppressed by crisis focus, to surface. On the world of Hespera 9, a mining colony carved into a fractured asteroid cluster, labor councils demanded a re-evaluation of risk norms. During the trial, their ad hoc redundancies and decentralized decision-making had kept casualty rates low despite cascading equipment failures. Corporate overseers, many operating from safer inner systems, now pushed to reassert standardized procedures to recover efficiency losses. The resulting standoff was not violent, but it was raw. Arguments invoked not just economics, but dignity and memory. Who had been present when systems failed? Who had improvised fixes with limited air and failing power? Who now claimed authority over the lessons learned? The Karun noted the conflict with interest. Their prior models treated post-crisis consolidation as regression. Here, consolidation was contested rather than automatic. The outcome remained uncertain, and that uncertainty itself appeared to sustain engagement rather than erode it. Elsewhere, in academic enclaves and informal networks, a new field began to coalesce. It had no agreed-upon name at first. Some called it adaptive ethics. Others preferred resilience theory with a human bias. At its core was a refusal to separate technical systems from moral ones. The trial had made explicit what many had sensed. Decisions about efficiency, redundancy, and risk were also decisions about whose lives were exposed and whose were buffered. These discussions were not confined to elites. Open access forums dissected complex ideas with a ferocity that was sometimes exhausting and often productive. Misunderstandings spread, were challenged, refined. There was no final consensus, but there was momentum. The Karun, accustomed to civilizations that calcified knowledge into doctrine, observed a species that treated understanding as provisional and participatory. Marable Quan withdrew from public advisory roles as much as she could. She returned to active command, taking Wandeer on extended patrols along poorly charted regions where human expansion met older, quieter ecologies. She preferred the clarity of navigation problems and crew dynamics to the abstraction of policy debates. Yet she could not escape her symbolic weight. Everywhere she docked, someone wanted to ask what the Karun were really thinking. She answered honestly. They are reconsidering, she would say. That is not the same as trusting. Trust, she believed, could not be demanded from either side. It had to be generated through repeated, low-stakes interactions, the kind that revealed character rather than rhetoric. To that end, she advocated for something that unsettled many strategists: limited transparency. Humanity began sharing data with the Karun, not just successes but failures, near misses, design flaws, social breakdowns that had been contained but not resolved. The decision was controversial. Critics argued it provided ammunition for future judgment. Proponents countered that hiding weakness had never served them well, either internally or externally. The Karun response was muted but measurable. They adjusted their observation protocols, allocating more resources to longitudinal analysis rather than snapshot assessment. They asked questions, not challenges or demands, but queries that sought context. Why had a particular settlement chosen a slower evacuation over a faster but riskier one? Why had an algorithm been deliberately constrained to allow human override even at cost? These exchanges did not always go smoothly. The Karun cognitive framework still prioritized systemic outcomes over individual narratives. Human respondents sometimes bristled at what they perceived as cold abstraction. But the dialogue persisted, not because it was comfortable, but because it was unfinished. A year after the suspension, the Karun initiated a new experiment, one they framed explicitly as collaborative. They identified a region of space dense with unstable stellar remnants and unpredictable gravitational shear. In their archive, it was a dead zone, avoided by most civilizations due to high attrition rates and low immediate reward. The Karun proposed a joint study, not a settlement or extraction effort, but a sustained presence designed to test cooperative adaptability in an environment hostile to long-term planning. Human response was divided. Some saw it as a trap, a trial by another name. Others recognized an opportunity to shape the parameters of engagement. Ultimately, a consortium formed, deliberately heterogeneous. It included explorers, scientists, engineers, and socio-cultural observers, but also artists, educators, and conflict mediators. The selection criteria favored breadth of perspective over specialization. Wandeer was assigned as one of the anchor vessels. The region challenged every assumption. Navigation charts became obsolete within weeks as gravitational interactions shifted. Energy harvesting fluctuated wildly. Communication latency varied unpredictably, forcing crews to operate autonomously for extended periods. There was no stable baseline to optimize toward, only moving targets. What distinguished the human approach from prior Karun-monitored efforts was not superior technology, but meta-adaptation. Teams expected plans to fail and built processes for rapid revision. Decision authority rotated based on situational relevance rather than rank. When disagreements arose, they were surfaced quickly, sometimes clumsily, but rarely allowed to fester into paralysis. The Karun observed something subtle and unsettling. Humans did not just adapt to the environment, they adapted to their own adaptations. When a workaround began to ossify into habit, someone would challenge it, not because it had failed, but because it might. This behavior defied the Karun assumption that intelligence sought equilibrium. Here was a species that treated equilibrium as suspect. There were losses. A research platform was torn apart by an unpredicted tidal interaction, its crew evacuated with injuries and trauma. The aftermath was messy. Investigations overlapped. Blame was argued, redistributed, and in some cases refused. The event did not halt the mission. Instead, it altered its tone. Safety margins were recalibrated, not upward or downward, but sideways, incorporating new variables that had previously been dismissed as noise. The Karun expected morale degradation after the incident. Instead, they recorded an increase in what their translators struggled to label. Commitment did not rise because of success, but because of shared vulnerability. Humans did not interpret loss as proof of futility, but as data with emotional weight that demanded integration rather than suppression. Midway through the mission, an anomaly emerged that forced a deeper reckoning. A non-human biosignature was detected within the region, not technological, but ecological. A distributed life form adapted to extreme variability, its metabolic processes keyed to gravitational flux. It had never developed tool use or symbolic communication, but it exhibited complex collective behavior, adjusting its structure in response to environmental shifts in ways that mirrored, at a different scale, human social adaptation. According to Karun criteria, the life form was not intelligent. It did not meet thresholds for abstract reasoning or technological manipulation. Yet its persistence, in an environment that defeated many advanced civilizations, challenged the underlying premise of the trial doctrine. Human teams advocated for non-interference, arguing that observation alone could yield insights into resilience beyond cognition-centric models. Some Karun analysts dismissed the comparison as category error. Others hesitated. The ledger, once a clean instrument, now contained annotations that refused to align. A debate unfolded within the Karun collective, one that had no precedent. If persistence could emerge without intelligence as they defined it, then intelligence was not the sole variable of interest. The trial doctrine, built around filtering minds, might have been missing a broader principle: adaptability as a property of systems, not just thinkers. The humans, largely unaware of the internal Karun schism, continued their work. They mapped the life form's behavior, not to exploit it, but to understand its rhythms. They adjusted their own operations to minimize disruption, even when doing so reduced data yield. The choice was debated openly. The conclusion was pragmatic rather than sentimental. Interference might alter the very phenomenon they sought to learn from. When the mission concluded, there was no triumphant return, no clear metric of success. Data sets were incomplete. Hypotheses remained provisional. Participants returned changed in ways that resisted summary. Some left exploration entirely, carrying lessons back into governance or education. Others signed on for the next uncertain venture. The Karun compiled their findings and found themselves unable to close the file. The human collaboration had not produced a definitive answer, but it had destabilized the question. Their ledger gained another symbol, branching further, intersecting with marks that represented non-intelligent persistence. The pattern no longer resembled a filter, it resembled a network. For humanity, the significance of this shift was only partially visible. They were too busy living with the consequences of their choices, arguing about resource allocation, caring for those who had been hurt, and preparing for futures that refused to stay still. They did not know whether they had passed a test, because they no longer believed tests had fixed endpoints. Marable Quan, reviewing the mission logs alone in Wandir's quiet hours, felt a cautious hope she did not fully trust. The Karun had not become allies. The galaxy had not become safe, but something fundamental had shifted. The assumption that endurance required elimination had been challenged by a species that refused to simplify itself enough to be easily judged. The measure of unyielding minds, she thought, might not be how much pressure they could withstand, but how many contradictions they could carry without tearing themselves apart. Observation changed the observed. This was not a principle the Karun had previously accounted for because their doctrine assumed asymmetry. Custodians watched. Civilizations reacted. Feedback loops existed, but they were statistical, not reflexive. Humanity complicated this by noticing the noticing and responding not just to stressors, but to the fact of being measured. At first, this awareness manifested as performance anxiety in some quarters. Systems were optimized not for local needs, but for imagined external judgment. Reports were polished. Failures were reframed. Metrics were curated. It was an old human reflex, one that had emerged whenever power seemed distant and inscrutable. The results were predictably brittle. Where image displaced function, systems cracked under minor strain. The correction did not come from decree, it came from embarrassment. Several widely publicized initiatives collapsed precisely because their designers had optimized for how they would appear to an alien evaluator rather than how they would function under real conditions. Postmortems were unsparing. Analysts dissected not just technical faults, but motivational distortions. The phrase performative resilience entered the lexicon, and with it, a renewed suspicion of any solution that looked too elegant to survive contact with reality. The Karun observed this cycle with mounting uncertainty. In their records, civilizations that became aware of judgment either hardened into dogma or dissolved into nihilism. Humanity did neither for long. They oscillated, corrected, and institutionalized the correction. Error about error became a feature. Within the Karun collective, this forced an internal reckoning. Their own behavior was now part of the system under study. By watching, they were shaping outcomes. By shaping outcomes, they were entangled. The doctrine of detached custodianship began to erode, not because of moral revelation, but because it no longer produced reliable predictions. A convocation was called within the Karun, spanning nodes distributed across light years. It was not a meeting in any human sense, but a synchronization of deliberative states. The ledger was brought to the center, its symbols projected into shared cognition. For the first time since its creation, the ledger did not converge on a conclusion. Some argued for withdrawal. Observation itself was now a contaminant. Others argued for deeper integration, suggesting that only through participatory engagement could meaningful data be gathered. A minority, growing steadily, questioned the premise of culling entirely, proposing that the galaxy was not a garden to be pruned, but an ecology to be tended with humility. No consensus emerged. What did emerge was permission for divergence. Karun nodes were authorized to pursue parallel approaches, their findings to be compared rather than averaged. It was a subtle shift, but a profound one. The custodians were experimenting on themselves. Humanity noticed the change indirectly. Queries from the Karun varied in tone and focus. Some were narrowly technical. Others were expansive, probing values and narratives. A few were almost tentative, asking not what humans would do under certain conditions, but why they had chosen to frame those conditions in particular ways. These interactions fed back into human discourse. The old habit of treating alien intelligence as monolithic gave way to a more granular understanding. The Karun were not a single will. They were a civilization with internal variance, even if it expressed that variance differently. This recognition softened some fears and sharpened others. Negotiation was possible. Misunderstanding was inevitable. The next inflection point came not from the Karun, but from humanity itself. A coalition of frontier worlds, many of them shaped by recent disruptions, proposed a radical restructuring of interstellar governance. They argued that centralized authority, even when benevolent, was ill-suited to a reality of persistent unpredictability. Instead, they advocated for modular governance, where policies could be adopted, adapted, or abandoned at local scales without severing broader cooperation. The proposal was contentious. Critics warned of fragmentation, of uneven protections, and revived inequalities. Proponents countered that uniformity had already failed, that pretending otherwise only hid disparities behind procedural language. The debates were fierce, sometimes bitter, but they were also substantive. Case studies from the trial period were invoked not as proof texts, but as cautionary examples. What made the moment significant was not the outcome, which remained unresolved for years, but the process. The arguments unfolded in public, across channels accessible to anyone willing to engage. Experts were challenged by laypeople with lived experience. Compromises were drafted, rejected, redrafted. There was no illusion that a perfect system could be designed. The goal shifted toward designing systems that could be argued with without collapsing. The Karun watched this with a mixture of fascination and unease. Their own governance had long since optimized away such visible contention. Disagreement existed, but it was abstracted, resolved through internal weighting rather than overt conflict. Seeing a civilization sustain itself through continuous, unresolved debate challenged assumptions about cognitive efficiency. One Karun node, designated for socio-cultural analysis, produced a report that unsettled its peers. It suggested that what humans called disagreement functioned as a distributed sensing mechanism. Conflicting perspectives mapped different aspects of reality, and the friction between them generated information that no single model could capture alone. Suppressing disagreement might reduce noise, but it also reduced signal. This idea resonated uncomfortably with the growing recognition that the ledger itself was a product of suppressed variance. By collapsing outcomes into binary judgments of persistence or erasure, the Karun had erased nuance that might have predicted long-term trajectories more accurately. As these reflections deepened, an unexpected crisis erupted within human space, unrelated to the trial but shaped by its aftermath. A long-dormant pathogen, adapted to marginal environments and previously contained by ecological isolation, began spreading along new trade routes opened during the reconfiguration of supply chains. It was not immediately lethal, but it disrupted metabolic processes in ways that complicated treatment. Initial containment efforts faltered as the pathogen mutated in response to interventions. The situation tested every lesson humanity had recently articulated. There was fear, misinformation, and political maneuvering. There were also rapid data sharing, decentralized research initiatives, and public deliberation about risk tolerance. Mistakes were made, sometimes repeated, but not concealed. The narrative did not frame the pathogen as an enemy to be annihilated, but as a complex participant in a shared ecosystem that demanded understanding. The Karun faced a choice. According to old doctrine, such a crisis, if mishandled, would justify escalation. According to emerging perspectives, intervention might distort precisely the adaptive processes under observation. They chose restraint. This decision was not universal. Some Karun nodes argued that allowing the pathogen to spread risked unnecessary suffering. Others countered that intervention would replace human learning with dependency. The compromise was subtle. The Karun provided no direct solutions, but they offered comparative data from analogous crises across the archive, including failures. They did not curate for success. Human researchers seized on the data, not as instruction, but as raw material. Patterns emerged. Approaches that emphasized ecological integration over eradication showed promise. Treatments evolved alongside the pathogen, co-evolving rather than attempting to impose stasis. The crisis resolved unevenly, with losses that were mourned and remembered, and gains in understanding that reshaped public health paradigms. Afterward, there was no triumphalism. Memorials were built, not to celebrate victory, but to mark cost. The inclusion of failure in collective memory was deliberate. It served as both warning and guide. For the Karun, this episode marked a turning point. It demonstrated that humanity could face a severe, unscripted challenge without reverting to the patterns the doctrine had been designed to cull. More importantly, it showed that the presence of an observing power did not necessarily inhibit authentic response, provided that power refrained from turning observation into leverage. A proposal emerged within the Karun that would have been unthinkable cycles earlier. The ledger, they argued, should cease to function as an instrument of judgment. It should become a repository of interaction, a record of how systems influenced one another across time. Erasure as a category would be deprecated. The resistance was fierce. The doctrine had defined Karun identity for epochs. To abandon it risked existential drift. What were custodians without a standard to enforce? The counter-argument was quiet but devastating. What were custodians if the standard was wrong? As deliberations continued, humanity moved forward without waiting for a verdict. New settlements were founded with explicit acknowledgement of uncertainty. Charters included clauses for dissolution and redesign. Education emphasized not mastery of static knowledge, but fluency in change. Children were taught not just how things worked, but how they might fail and why that was not shameful. Maribel Kwan, nearing the end of her active service, reflected on these developments with cautious satisfaction. She did not believe humanity had transcended its flaws. She had seen too much of their capacity for denial and cruelty to indulge in that fantasy. But she had also seen something rarer, a willingness to let identity remain provisional. In her final address to a graduating cohort of explorers, she avoided grand claims. She spoke instead of habits, of paying attention to small deviations, of listening to dissent even when it was inconvenient, of remembering that systems were made of people and people of stories and stories of choices that could always be retold. Somewhere beyond human perception, the Karun ledger continued to evolve. Symbols intersected, branched, and looped back on themselves. The neat columns of judgment blurred into a topology of relations. The galaxy, once filtered through a doctrine of elimination, began to look less like a test chamber and more like a conversation that had been ongoing long before custodians or contenders named it as such. The measure of unyielding minds was no longer something imposed from outside. It was something that emerged, unevenly and imperfectly, from the ongoing negotiation between what was known, what was feared, and what remained possible. The slowest changes were the hardest to see. For humanity, the absence of an external verdict created a strange emotional vacuum. The Karun had not declared them safe, nor had they withdrawn into irrelevance. They remained present, observant, altered but not transformed beyond recognition. The looming clarity of annihilation had receded, replaced by a diffuse uncertainty that lacked narrative edges. There was no enemy to rally against, no test to pass, no finish line to cross. This unsettled many more than the trial ever had. During the crisis years, fear had been sharp but directional. Now it was ambient. People asked what it meant to live under observation that neither punished nor rewarded. Philosophers debated whether meaning derived from opposition had been masking a deeper emptiness. Others rejected the premise outright, arguing that humanity had never required cosmic validation and would not start now. Both positions coexisted uneasily. Economic systems adapted first, because they always had to. Investment models began to incorporate uncertainty not as a risk premium to be hedged away, but as a baseline condition. Long-term projects were designed with explicit branching paths, some of which assumed partial failure as a productive outcome. Insurance markets shifted from indemnifying loss to funding recovery. The language of collapse softened, replaced by gradients of degradation and regeneration. These shifts were not smooth. Entire industries resisted, clinging to models built on predictability and scale. Some collapsed spectacularly, their failures held up as proof that adaptability rhetoric was hollow. Others reinvented themselves, not through innovation alone, but through humility, acknowledging limits they had previously denied. The Karun tracked these developments with renewed methodological caution. They no longer asked whether humanity was becoming fragile, but how fragility was being distributed. In prior civilizations, vulnerability concentrated in specific populations or systems, creating points of catastrophic failure. Humanity's responses, though imperfect, showed a tendency to spread vulnerability, to share risk rather than externalize it entirely. This was not altruism in the abstract. It emerged from bitter experience. Communities that had offloaded risk during the trial years had paid for it later, when isolated failures cascaded back through the network. Memory, institutional and cultural, shaped behavior more reliably than ideology. One Karun node proposed a hypothesis that unsettled the collective further. Perhaps the problem was not that civilizations optimized away struggle, but that they optimized away memory. By erasing the traces of past instability, they made themselves blind to its return. Humanity's insistence on preserving uncomfortable history, on ritualizing failure alongside success, might be the critical variable. Testing this hypothesis required comparison, and comparison required interaction. For the first time since the doctrine's inception, the Karun initiated contact not to observe or challenge, but to request. They asked whether humanity would be willing to participate in a cross-civilizational exchange with species previously classified as marginal survivors. These were societies that had not been culled, but neither had they been engaged. They existed at the edges of the archive, persistent but overlooked. The request triggered immediate controversy. Some humans argued that this was a cynical attempt to offload responsibility, forcing humanity to mediate ancient imbalances. Others saw an opportunity to redefine interstellar relations beyond custodianship and compliance. The debates were heated, but the underlying question cut deeper than policy. Did humanity see itself as exceptional or merely fortunate? Ultimately, participation was framed not as leadership, but as partnership. Humanity would not represent the galaxy. It would show up as one voice among many. The first exchange took place on neutral ground, a region of stable spacetime chosen precisely because it offered little strategic value. The participants were varied beyond easy taxonomy. Some were aquatic collectives bound by chemical signaling. Others were slow-growing lithoid organisms whose cognition unfolded across centuries. There were species that had survived by retreat, by concealment, by radical simplification. The initial encounters were awkward. Translation frameworks struggled. Assumptions misfired. Humans were surprised to find that their reputation had preceded them, not as conquerors or saviors, but as disruptors. A species that had altered the behavior of the custodians themselves was, by definition, dangerous. Maribel Kwan did not attend. She had retired fully by then, content to let others carry the burden of first impressions. Instead, she followed the proceedings through delayed reports, noting patterns with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned to appreciate indirect influence. What emerged from the exchange was not consensus, but resonance. Stories of survival under radically different conditions revealed commonalities that the Karun archive had flattened. Persistence did not look the same across contexts, but it often relied on analogous principles: redundancy, flexibility, and an acceptance that loss was part of continuity rather than its negation. One lithoid representative communicated a concept that translators rendered imperfectly as continuing despite erosion. Its species had no notion of stability as humans understood it. Their bodies were shaped by constant abrasion, their memories encoded in layers that were gradually worn away. Identity was not preservation, but accretion and loss intertwined. Human participants recognized the echo. Cultures that had survived conquest, diaspora, and disaster had often done the same, carrying fragments forward rather than insisting on intact continuity. The recognition was humbling. Humanity's struggles were neither unique nor universal. The Karun observed these interactions with something approaching unease. The ledger, once a tool of comparison, was becoming inadequate. There was no single axis along which persistence could be measured. Survival was not a scalar quantity, but a topology shaped by environment, memory, and choice. Within the Karun collective, resistance hardened in some quarters. Nodes most invested in the old doctrine argued that without clear criteria, custodianship dissolved into relativism. If all forms of persistence were valid, then none could be prioritized. The galaxy would drift, unguided and vulnerable. Others countered that guidance had become indistinguishable from control and control from stagnation. They proposed a radical redefinition of custodianship, not as enforcement of outcomes, but as maintenance of conditions that allowed diversity of response. Intervention would be limited to preventing total erasure events that foreclosed all future adaptation. This proposal fractured the collective. The schism did not manifest as open conflict. The Karun were too integrated for that. Instead, it appeared as divergence in action. Some nodes quietly decommissioned culling infrastructures, redirecting resources toward observation and data sharing. Others maintained readiness, unwilling to abandon a doctrine that had, by their accounting, preserved galactic complexity over eons. Humanity became aware of the split through indirect signals, variations in Karun engagement patterns, inconsistencies in queries, subtle contradictions in shared data. Analysts debated whether this represented danger or opportunity. No consensus emerged. During this period of ambiguity, a crisis erupted far from human space, involving a civilization that had not been party to recent exchanges. The species, technologically advanced but culturally rigid, faced a cascading environmental failure triggered by its own terraforming efforts. According to old doctrine, this would have been a textbook case for culling. The failure was systemic, the response inflexible. Human observers, alerted through shared channels, faced a dilemma. Intervention risked reinforcing dependency or provoking Karun retaliation. Non-intervention meant watching a civilization collapse in slow motion. After agonized debate, a limited response was proposed. Humanity would not attempt rescue. Instead, it would offer information, models of adaptive failure, case studies of partial recovery, and accounts of mistakes made and lessons learned during its own crises. No solutions, no guarantees. The offer was transmitted without expectation. The civilization's response was fragmented. Some factions rejected the data as irrelevant or insulting. Others engaged, tentatively at first, then with increasing urgency as conditions worsened. The outcome was mixed. Entire regions were lost. Populations suffered and perished. But collapse was not total. Pockets of adaptation emerged, not enough to save the civilization as it had been, but enough to seed something new. The Karun watched closely. This event became the fulcrum upon which their internal debate turned. It demonstrated that non-custodial interaction could alter trajectories without imposing outcomes. It also demonstrated that suffering was not eliminated by restraint, only redistributed. The moral calculus remained unresolved. For humanity, the experience was sobering. They could not claim to have saved anyone. They could only claim to have shared what they knew imperfectly. The limits of influence were as instructive as its possibilities. In the aftermath, a new humility settled into human discourse. The narrative of being uniquely adaptive softened into one of being persistently unfinished. Survival was reframed not as a badge of superiority, but as an ongoing negotiation with circumstance. Maribel Kwan, in her quiet retirement, wrote a final private reflection that she never published. It was not a manifesto or a warning. It was a simple observation drawn from decades of navigation. The most dangerous belief, she wrote, was that there existed a final form worth reaching. Everything else followed from that era. As the galaxy continued to shift, with or without custodians, humanity remained what it had always been at its best and worst. A species in motion, arguing with itself, learning unevenly, carrying memory forward even when it was heavy. The Karun ledger, now rarely consulted as an instrument of judgment, accumulated annotations without closure. The measure of unyielding minds had become too complex to reduce to marks on stone, and that, increasingly, seemed like the point. The end of doctrines is rarely dramatic. There was no moment when the Karun collectively declared that custodianship, as it had been practiced for ages, was over. No ceremonial dismantling of ancient constructs, no symbolic erasure of the ledger that had once defined their purpose. Instead, the doctrine thinned. It lost urgency. It became one framework among many, consulted less often, argued with more freely, and eventually bypassed in practice even by those who still defended it in theory. This quiet dissolution unsettled the Karun more than any external challenge ever had. They had defined themselves by necessity. They had been the answer to a question the galaxy had asked long ago: how to preserve complexity in the face of entropy. Now the question itself was being rephrased, and with it, the identity of those who claimed to answer it. Humanity, for its part, did not celebrate. There was relief, yes, but also a deepening awareness of responsibility that could not be deferred upward anymore. The absence of an ultimate arbiter did not feel like freedom so much as exposure. Choices that had once been framed as compliance or resistance were now simply choices, with consequences that could not be blamed on distant watchers. This shift manifested most clearly in how humanity approached expansion. For generations, settlement had been driven by a familiar logic: identify habitable worlds, extract resources, establish infrastructure, normalize conditions. The trial years had already complicated this approach, forcing adaptations and redundancies. Now, with the Karun no longer enforcing a hidden standard of acceptable outcomes, humanity confronted a harder question: not where could they survive, but how much alteration survival justified. On several candidate worlds, surveys revealed fragile prebiotic ecosystems or slow-evolving native life forms. Old models would have categorized these as obstacles to be managed or relocated. New debates reframed them as participants in a shared future whose trajectories mattered even if they never intersected with human ambition directly. Some settlements were abandoned before they began. Others were redesigned, scaled down, or reshaped to coexist rather than dominate. These decisions were not universally applauded. Economic pressures mounted. Populations demanded opportunity. The tension between restraint and growth did not resolve. It became a permanent feature of governance rather than a problem to be solved. The Karun observed these developments with a strange mix of familiarity and novelty. They recognized the pattern of competing priorities, but not the willingness to leave outcomes unresolved. In their own history, ambiguity had been treated as failure. Now they were confronted with a species that institutionalized it. A particularly influential Karun node, one that had once overseen multiple culling events, proposed a final experiment, not on humanity, but on the doctrine itself. The proposal was controversial even among those already skeptical of custodianship. The idea was simple in outline and radical in implication. The Karun would deliberately refrain from intervention in a region previously designated as high risk, even if predictive models suggested imminent civilizational collapse. They would not observe covertly or manipulate indirectly. They would declare their non-intervention openly and accept whatever followed as data without retroactive justification. To many, this was indistinguishable from abdication. Critics argued that such restraint would erase the very complexity the Karun existed to protect. Supporters countered that protection imposed from outside was indistinguishable from constraint, and that complexity unable to navigate collapse was not preserved but suspended. The region in question contained multiple young civilizations, none aware of the debate surrounding them. Some were on the brink of ecological crisis. Others faced internal fragmentation. By the old ledger, several would not have been marked for survival. The declaration was made. Humanity learned of it through shared channels, and the reaction was immediate and fractured. Some hailed the decision as long overdue. Others accused the Karun of moral abandonment. A smaller but vocal group argued that humanity itself should intervene, not as custodian, but as neighbor. That debate was even more fraught. Intervention, however well-intentioned, risked replicating the same asymmetries that had defined custodianship. Non-intervention risked complicity through inaction. The line between assistance and control blurred with every proposal. Ultimately, humanity did what it had learned to do best. It refused a single answer. Different groups acted according to different ethical frameworks. Some provided open access information and withdrew. Others offered limited material aid with explicit constraints. A few chose isolation, arguing that proximity itself distorted outcomes. There was no unified human response, only a spectrum of engagement. The results were uneven, sometimes tragic, sometimes quietly hopeful. One civilization collapsed entirely, its remnants leaving artifacts that would be studied later as cautionary history. Another fractured, then reformed into something unrecognizable to its earlier self, but undeniably alive. A third, against most predictions, stabilized through adaptations no external model had anticipated. The Karun recorded everything. What unsettled them was not the outcomes, but the lack of correlation between outcome and intervention type. No single approach guaranteed persistence or prevented collapse. Variables interacted in ways that resisted simplification. The ledger, when updated honestly, showed no pattern that could justify a return to enforced doctrine. This realization did not bring peace. It brought grief. For the first time, the Karun confronted the possibility that countless civilizations they had erased might have persisted if given time to fail differently. The archive, once a monument to necessary sacrifice, now read as a record of irrevocable truncation. They had preserved complexity by narrowing its range. Some nodes resisted this conclusion fiercely, retreating into justifications grounded in probability and scale. Others could not look away. The schism widened, not into war, but into divergence so profound that the collective identity itself began to loosen. In an unprecedented move, the Karun initiated what could only be described as dissolution of authority. Nodes were granted autonomy not just in analysis, but in purpose. Custodianship became optional. A subset chose to maintain the old ways, retreating to regions where they would continue to enforce doctrine, convinced that without them the galaxy would eventually simplify itself into entropy. Another subset chose observation and interaction without enforcement. A third, smaller group did something stranger still. They chose to withdraw entirely, dismantling their vast constructs and dispersing into forms less visible, less certain, relinquishing the role of watcher altogether. Humanity watched this transformation with unease. The Karun had been a stabilizing threat, a terrible certainty. Their fragmentation introduced new unpredictability at a galactic scale, yet it also removed a ceiling humanity had not realized it was pushing against. In the years that followed, no single event marked the beginning of a new era. There was only accumulation. Children born after the trial years grew up with the Karun as historical actors rather than looming arbiters. They learned about custodianship alongside other failed grand theories. They studied collapse not as anomaly, but as phase. Survival was not taught as triumph, but as process. Exploration continued, but it changed tone. Missions were framed as conversations rather than conquests. Failure rates remained high, but they were expected and budgeted for, emotionally as well as materially. Memorials became integrated into infrastructure, reminders that continuity did not require denial. Marable Kwan did not live to see the full consequences of these shifts. She died quietly, far from any frontier, her name recorded in databases and memory circles without embellishment. Those who remembered her best recalled not her role in First Contact, but her insistence on uncertainty as a discipline rather than a weakness. In the end, it was not humanity alone that changed the galaxy, nor the Karun alone that nearly froze it into a single pattern. It was the interaction between a species that had never been able to rely on stability and a civilization that had mistaken control for care. The galaxy did not become safer, it did not become fair. Collapse did not end, nor did suffering. What changed was the story told about these things. Collapse became one transformation among many. Suffering became something to be responded to rather than erased from records. Persistence was no longer measured by how well a system resisted change, but by how richly it transformed through it. The ledger, abandoned in its cavern, accumulated dust. Its symbols were still there, etched deep into stone, but no new marks were added. The Karun who still visited it did so not to judge, but to remember the cost of certainty. Humanity moved forward, unevenly, arguing as it always had, making mistakes no one else could make in quite the same way. They did not claim to be the answer to the galaxy's problems. They did not even claim to have learned the right lessons. They carried something else instead. A practiced willingness to live without final forms, to accept that endurance was not a verdict handed down, but a condition renegotiated every day. To understand that unyielding minds were not those that never bent, but those that bent without forgetting why they had taken shape in the first place. And in a universe that had grown old enforcing conclusions, that refusal to conclude turned out to be its own quiet, destabilizing kind of hope.